Welcome on into the Utah Blockcast. I'm Steve Bartle, the Utah Insider for KSL Sports. I want to say thank you to everybody that's been tuning in on YouTube and listening to the podcast. Appreciate everybody for the support of me and the Utah Blockcast. It's been a lot of fun, and if you guys wouldn't mind, subscribe to that YouTube channel, leave a 5-star rating, do the things that help the podcast. It's much appreciated. I'm excited for the summer, what's to come. I've been enjoying these solo episodes, but I'm excited to get back to work with Cam Beck and Tyson Mall and everybody. So really looking forward to getting those guys back on here as well. And on this episode. Um, took a week off. I hope everybody had a good Memorial Day weekend. I certainly did. Had a great time with my family, and I hope everybody uh, had the opportunity to enjoy time with theirs as well. And with that extended break, I spent a good amount of time doing a deeper dive across the Big 12. And so on this episode, I'm going to be diving into my personal Big 12 rankings. I think, me and Mitch Harper at KSL Sports are working on, our collaborative Big 12 rankings, our post spring rankings. And so I've got mine, and I've actually had to tweak them a bit over the weekend from what I sent Mitch earlier last week. So this has been fun to actually do my homework and do a deep dive into each one of these teams and get a feel for the rest of the conference. I think this is going to be very similar to last year, where you've got some favorites, you've got some dangerous teams that are knocking on the door of title contention, and then you've got some dangerous, even volatile threats in the Big 12. And then, of course, you're going to have your schools at the bottom as well. And I think there's some obvious candidates with that. So I've got my Big 12 personal rankings that I'm going to go through on this. I've got all 16 teams ranked and split up into 4 different tiers. So I'll be going through all of that on this episode. But first, I wanted to share, that story about Devin Dampier over the weekend, about him, making that big donation to North Canyon football. North Canyon is a high school located in the Phoenix area, and Devin Dampier actually went to Seguro High School, one of the better high school football programs, in the Phoenix area, and so that made the donation kind of unique. And after talking with some folks, I was waiting to hear from a couple people close to Devin about the situation and why he decided to donate to North Canyon. And it's actually a really cool story. So Devin Dampier's younger brother Dom is on the team, and Devin has been working a lot in the Phoenix area this offseason, has spent a lot of time with Dom's teammates. And as they've spent more time together, Devin, uh, you know, found the inspiration and the motivation to make this donation and to send his younger brother, who is going to be a senior this fall, with a bit of style, and donated $9,000 to North Canyon football for 2 completely new sets of uniforms and other minor equipment that'll be useful to the Rattlers program as well. So pretty cool story. North Canyon. I was talking with the coach after I published the story, which you can read at KSL Sports. You can read the story there. But talking with the coach, it's a program that doesn't get a lot of support financially compared to some of the other teams in the area, and so to get that donation from Devin was really impactful, and really has done a lot because they've been using the same uniforms for the last couple seasons. So the Rattlers are going to be donning some new gear this season, and it's all thanks to Devin Dampier's donation. Which again, for all of the headaches and frustrations and annoying things that come with NIL, this is the good stuff. These are the good stories that stem from it as well. It gives these players opportunities to make these types of donations to give back to their communities. I know that Arizona State quarterback Sam Levitt also made a donation to the Pat Tillman Foundation over the weekend as well. And it's always just it's good to see those types of stories. So It's awesome, and Devin Dampier, that fits his personality type. It fits his leadership type. He was constantly talking of others, and I think this just speaks to who he is as a person. And I think a lot of Utah fans are really just growing more and more impressed with Devin and what he's done so far in his time with the program. So you can, if you didn't read that story, it's available at kslsports.com. You can find it on my Twitter. You can find it on Facebook as well. So pretty cool. And before we get into the meat and potatoes of this episode, uh, also want to mention that Utah is going to be hosting a big list of visitors this weekend. This kicks off a big month of recruiting across college football, where the next month is going to be loaded with official visitors. I think Utah's is over 40 official visitors for the month, and they'll welcome in 9 or 10 guys. I think they're still trying to finalize visit plans for one or two guys as well. So it's Wednesday. I am planning on doing another episode probably on Friday where I'll do more of an in depth look at each one of the visitors' recruitments and what's going on there and try to provide a good feel for what's to come over the weekend and all that. So excited about that. But first, I needed to get this done because, again, this has been something that's been in the works for about a week now, and I just needed to hit record and get it done. So let's dive into this episode, my Big 12 post spring power rankings. So, I did a lot to, um, understand my feelings of each program and my assessment in terms of how they played last year and what they've done, and then also, assessing what they've done to improve the roster and what they've done to address some issues and so that's sort of how I've gone about my power ranking is obviously it's a projection to the 2025 season, but I think understanding what each team accomplished last year, how they found success, what they return, as well as what they've added to the mix. I think it all kind of plays a part in my post spring power rankings. So let's get to these rankings here, and let's start from the bottom actually. And I actually have 5 tiers, so forgive me. I think I said four earlier in the show, but I actually have five, and we're just going to start from the bottom. The bottom four teams here. We've got. I'll just list them here, all four together. So 16, I have UCF with Scott Frost taking over. Obviously, there's good vibes, good memories of what Scott Frost accomplished there with the Knights there previously in his time. But this is going to be a unique situation because UCF is going through a pretty heavy makeover. This is a complete rebuild, and Scott Frost is starting from scratch. And the quarterback situation has to be ironed out, and there are three guys that they have in the mix there, with Trevin Jackson being the most likely candidate to emerge as the quarterback there. But with Scott Frost and the Knights, I have them 16th. And what's interesting is they're over under they're on the win total is 6.5. They finished 4-8 last year with a 2-7 record. In the conference, they've lost a lot of good pieces, right? So they obviously have to find a quarterback. They also have to find a running back as RG Harvey moved on to the NFL. They've done well in the portal as they typically do, but it's got to come together. And so I have the UCF Knights 16th there. Number 15, I've got the Oklahoma State Cowboys, and similarly, this is a program that's gone through a lot of changes. They still have Mike Gundy at the helm, and I think that's why I give them the nod over UCF here. Is at least they have that prominent figure at the helm still. And I think Oklahoma State, there were just a lot of issues last year that um, things didn't go their way. Ollie Gordon, you expect him to have a great year running behind the same offensive line that he did the year before, which led to big production, and yet He wasn't able to find any sort of traction in that passing game. Just wasn't able to get it done. And so they're going through a drastic overhaul with their roster as well. Specifically at that quarterback position, they've got a quarterback battle between Haas Haney, who I think is going to emerge as the quarterback there for the Cowboys. They have a win total over under of 5.5 wins. I think I would take the under on both of those for the Cowboys and Knights. But if I had to pick it over between either of those teams, I would take the Cowboys. I think they're better suited to make a jump from where they were last year. So, uh, getting to the number 14 team, Arizona. This is going to be interesting. With Noah Fafita back, he obviously is a veteran. He's seen and played a lot of football, but he's now going to be without Teteroa McMillan, and I think McMillan was a nice security blanket for him. They had a great chemistry, which was apparent from the moment Fafita took the field with McMillan, and so that's going to be a big question mark for me, and it's not something that I think is going to be easily replaced because you don't have first round talent, in that receiver room like you did with T Mac. So, I do think there is room for Fafita to get back to his 2023 form where he was more disciplined and executed the offense more efficiently. But I think that is a bit of a question mark because we now have 2 years of him heavily relying on T Mac to be the guy to bail him out, to create the big plays. And without that presence, I think it's going to be a more difficult adjustment, reverting back to that 2023 form where he did a good job of taking what defenses gave him, of spreading the ball around. It's going to be a difficult transition back to that style and that level of play. But I think the Wildcats have done a good job of addressing and trying to rebuild this roster with good pieces. They have an over under win total of 5.5 wins. It's going to be tough. I think five. I've settled on 5 wins for them this season. If Noah Fafita can get back to the player he was in 23, I think they've got a decent chance to get to 6, 7 wins next year. The last team in the bottom four, West Virginia, with Rich Rod returning, they've completely overhauled that roster. I think they've brought in something like 50 or 60 players, if not more, since Rich Rod has taken over. And, they've got to figure out their quarterback situation as well. They've got a couple nice pieces at the skill players. They lost a really good one to Ohio State, their running back that led the conference, who I'm blanking on his name, but was really dynamic. He transferred to Ohio State, but they've got Jaheim White, who's a dynamic back, who returns and will be a key piece to that backfield. They've also got a couple quarterbacks. One that I'm not going to, Nico. His last name starts with an M. I'm not going to try and say it, but they've got some pieces to work with in that backfield, and I think that's going to be key. And I think Rich Rod just has a formula where they can get back to 5 wins, and that's kind of the over under is 5.5 wins for the Mountaineers. I've got them right at 5 wins as well. So that's the bottom four. For me, the next tier, I'm a little more optimistic on with this group. This is a high variance, high risk type of group where they're capable of knocking off ranked teams. Perhaps they're capable of contending and competing at a good level. But there's also great risk where they could lose to just about anybody in the conference. So at number 12, I have the Houston Cougars, and they finished last year with a 4-8 record, 3-6 in the Big 12. Their over under is 5.5 wins with Willie Fritz. This is now we're getting into where you start to see the dividends of a program builder like Willie Fritz. And, he's done a good job of establishing a competitive culture there with Houston, and that was pretty apparent last year. They didn't have the guys, the dudes, but they were just competitive. And, it took them time to kind of get going, to build momentum. But by the middle of the season, I think they turned a corner. And so, that's going to be a team that continues to rely on their defense. And with Connor Wakeman, coming in as a high upside quarterback. Still, I think there's a chance for pretty solid improvement where you go from 4 wins potentially to 6, 7. I would take the over on the Houston Cougars next year. So I think the key stretch for them. It's a back to back in the middle of October. These are two must wins for them to get to 6 wins, in my opinion. They're on the road at Oklahoma State, and then they return home to Houston to take on the Arizona Wildcats. For me, those are two must win games for the Houston Cougars and Willie Fritz. I think that's going to be super important for them. So next on the list, number 11, Cincinnati Bearcats. They finished last year at 5-7, 11th in the Big 12 with the 3-6 record in conference. Their win total, over under win total, is 6.5. With Cincinnati, I really like Brendan Sorsby as a quarterback. I think he's done a lot. He did a lot last year. He seemed capable of making a variety of throws and important throws. Um, they've lost some skill players, they've lost some receivers, but I think they've done a good job of bringing in receivers from the transfer portal that can come in and kind of pick up where those players left off. They do have a star running back in Corey Kiner gone to the NFL, but they brought in Tyree Walker to fill that gap. And reports throughout spring ball on him were pretty promising. So, with the Bearcats, I think the defense hinges on the defensive line, with Dante Corleone being a big piece to that unit. He's going to be returning from injury. If he's dominant, I think Cincy could sneak into that 7 win territory, perhaps push to 8. I think that's going to be it's going to be important for Sorsby to take a big jump. I thought that he was a very capable quarterback that just didn't do enough in those final moments, in those clutch moments, and I think that's where he's got to take a step forward. But I really like Sorsby. I think he's um, I think he's a good quarterback. And then two, with the Bearcats, injuries caught up with them over the course of the season, and so that's going to be another thing: is can they maintain their health over the course of the season? But I'm cautiously optimistic about the Bearcats and what they can be in the Big 12 next year. Their win total is 6.5. I think that's a really spot on number. I go back and forth between 6 and 7 wins for them. Next up, this is the last team in this tier, the Kansas Jayhawks. Last year it was bad. They were down bad for most of the year, but then Jalen Daniels, refound that magic, over the final month of the season and led them to big wins over BYU, Colorado, and Iowa State in consecutive weeks over the final month of the season. And, he just reminded everybody of what he's capable of as a dual threat quarterback. Now, with the Jayhawks, they've lost a lot of pieces, and they've lost a dynamic running back in Devin Neal, who went on to the NFL. They lost a couple of receivers and a couple of key defensive players, specifically in that defensive secondary. They've got to replace 2 cornerbacks. So there's a lot to replace. But if Jalen Daniels can regain that form that he had 2 years ago, which he looked to find over the final month of the season, that's where this Jayhawks team is sort of the wild card of the Big 12 conference. They can beat just about anybody. They can also lose to just about anybody. So this is kind of the model program for this tier. They have their win total for 2025 is 7.5 wins, and I'm going to take the under on that. I'm not ready to fully trust Jalen Daniels just yet. I think they just have a lot to replace, but I think this is going to be another pesky team. So that's what I've got. I've got Houston at 12, Cincy at 11, and Kansas at 10, which gets us to the third tier, right? 3 tiers, third tier, tier 3, and this is the most dangerous. So this is a group of teams that I think they've got playoff level talent at certain spots, but there are significant question marks. that make them relatively volatile, and which again points to the dangerous uh, of each program. They can, it can go either way, where it can hurt you either way. So in this tier, let me see here. I gotta update this here for YouTube's sake. Tier three, Big 12's most dangerous, perhaps most volatile. I've got number nine, Colorado. Coach Prime. This is where we're going to really learn what Coach Prime is about as a head coach. Obviously, he's had tremendous talent with Travis Hunter and Shador Sanders, leading the way there. They finished last year 9-4 and 7-2 in the Big 12. Finished fourth in the conference. They have an over/under win total in 2025 of 6.5 wins. And we did our power rankings, after the 2024 season, back in January for KSL Sports, and I had Colorado second in my power rankings then. I thought, Coach Prime was going to take advantage of that momentum, in the transfer portal and bringing in a good quarterback, and I thought they did with Caden Salter. But, reading the reports throughout spring ball of Caden Salter's struggles, that's a big red flag for me, especially considering, the talent that Coach Prime has recruited at that skill position at receiver, and obviously with the offensive line in front of him. Last season's struggles are well documented thanks to Shador Sanders. But they've brought in a number of offensive line transfers again this year, and that's going to continue to be a big question mark. And throughout spring ball, Caden Salter just struggled, with executing the offense. He was a check down merchant, it sounds like. And so that to me is why I have Colorado at nine, is the fact that you have all this talent at the skill positions, but those two important position groups, quarterback and offensive line, are the two biggest question marks, on the roster. I think the defense is actually going to be pretty good, but they don't have a run game or refuse to rely on it, and so it's just that's sort of the big deal for me. I think they have a lot of talent. I think they have a ton of top end talent, to be more specific, but it's just they don't have the meat and potatoes that you need. So, if Caden Salters, if things click for him offensively, where he's grasping the offense and executing at a high level, this is a really dangerous team. But those are the question marks: is the offensive line and quarterback position. So I have them number nine. Number eight, I originally had them. I originally had them back in January with KSL Sports with our power rankings. I had them eighth, which was probably too high at the time considering the season that we were coming off of. But I liked what Utah did, and I know that Utah, lost a handful of games by single scores, and this scoring margin. If you look at the numbers, they actually ended up, positive in terms of the scoring difference between what they scored and what they allowed. I think they finished with 283 points scored and 248 points given up, which is just crazy. They finished 5-7, 2-7 in the Big 12. Their over under next year is 7.5 wins. I like what Utah has done in the transfer portal, starting with Devin Dampier. He was the guy that got this all rolling back in December, following Jason Beck to Salt Lake City, and getting to watch Devin Dampier, operate this spring. I was really impressed with his accuracy. Going back and, obviously you can look at the numbers and the completion percentage. It wasn't that strong. I think he was around 54, 55, 56% on the season. Obviously you see the numbers, the passing yard is 2,700 yards, 1,100 rushing yards, 31 total touchdowns, between passing and running. And, if you add that to the mix last year, Utah probably breaks through in a couple of those one-score games, and the season probably looks really different. But I think it's important to remember that this is a totally new schedule, and it's going to present its own unique challenges this year. But I like what Devin Dampier showed us throughout spring ball with his passing. I thought he improved as a passer, from what he looked like in 2024 compared to how he executed in spring ball. I think the fact that he's going to be operating behind this offensive line, I think, is actually going to be really helpful and beneficial to his game. If you go to Pro Football Focus, you look at some of the premium stats, you look at how he executed in a clean pocket. he was completing 63% of his passes and took really good care of the ball. And I think that's going to be the key for Devin Dampier is this offensive line providing protection, Devin Dampier making quick decisions. And we saw that throughout spring ball. And I think Jason Beck's offense provides some easy buttons, a lot of easy buttons that weren't present in the previous offense. And I think Devin Dampier, his command of the offense was very apparent throughout spring ball as you watched Isaac Wilson and Jamari Ficklin, learning the offense and how they sort of struggled but made progress throughout spring ball. Devin Dampier was able to execute at just a completely different level. His grasp and command of the offense was just very apparent. So that is the big reason why I'm optimistic and why I feel better about having them eighth. I wanted to move them up to seventh or sixth, but I think keeping them at eight with what the season they're coming off of, with the additions that they've made in the transfer portal and with the coaching staff, I think eight is fair. And I think Utah is going to need that defense to be really good again next year with Leonard Barton, Smith Snowden, Teo Johnson. I think I'm really excited about those three. I think sort of the key players and X factors for next year. I look at Dallas Vakalahi as a very important piece to next year's outlook. Strong safety Rabbit Evans is sort of the biggest X factor for me on that defensive side of the ball. If he plays the way he did in spring ball, I think he could be a really impactful and a big difference maker for Utah. And then at wide receiver, I've got Tobias Merriweather as kind of the biggest X factor, given the fact that Utah wanted to add a dynamic, elite trait, a traity type of receiver, a guy with elite traits that maybe hasn't put it all together. Tobias Merriweather at 6'5", 195 pounds with great speed, a big catch radius. He fits that mold, and I think with how this offense is going to look, obviously it's going to be centered on the run, and there's going to be a lot of run plays, but they want to take, Beck wants to take shots down the field. They want to move the ball vertically, and I think Tobias Merriweather and Larry Simmons both add to that dynamic of the vertical passing game. So I've got Utah at 8. Their over-under win total is 7.5. I take the over. I'm really comfortable with this team getting to 8 wins. It's just going to be, those one or two plays in those big games. And I think the key stretch for Utah next year is in the middle of October, where you welcome ASU to Salt Lake City. You go 50 miles south to Provo to take on BYU, and then you return them home the next week to take on the Colorado Buffaloes. I think Utah has to go 2 out of 3 in those games. They've got to win 2 out of 3. And that's going to be the key for them, is that stretch, those 3 games. They have another difficult stretch in November where, they'll welcome Kansas State to Salt Lake City. They'll finish the year with Kansas. But I think that stretch in October, that 3-game stretch, is going to be the key for Utah. They've got to find a way to win 2 or 3 of those games, as well as taking care of business, throughout the rest of the season. So I've got Utah at 8 with the over at 7.5 wins. And so that's where I like Utah. Number 7, I've got the TCU Horned Frogs. This team is interesting. With Josh Hoover returning, I like Josh Hoover. I wasn't overly impressed with Josh Hoover, but he did a great job of making throws and giving his players, opportunities to make plays. But he lost 2 big pass catchers for him in Jack Beck and Savion Williams. And they did a decent job of addressing those departures with Jordan Dwyer, a transfer from Idaho, who was one of the top receivers in the transfer portal market, as well as Joseph Manjack from Houston, who's kind of an underrated receiver. He doesn't wear gloves. He lives up to the name, I think, of Manjack. When you think Manjack, you just think, you think Joseph Manjack. Like, that's just, you think no gloves. You think just eye pain as a receiver and all that, no gloves, and just tough. So I've got TCU here. Their win total for 2025 is 6.5 wins. Pretty surprising, given the fact that they did return a good amount of players from last year's roster. But I think the big question mark for them is actually going to be the wide receiver position in replacing Beck and Williams. but also the offensive line. And that's surprising, given the fact that they returned most of that line, but the offensive line last year wasn't very good. There were just too many issues. They weren't able to generate a lot of movement in the run game, and that's kind of an issue, a well-known issue under Sonny Dykes is, his run games suffer. Big time passing attacks, but the run game suffers. So, the TCU Horned Frogs, I think they're always going to be tough, and I think they're going to have a tough defense. They've done well to address some needs on that side of the ball, specifically along the defensive line. But I think for them, I look at the stretch of at ASU against at home against Colorado, going on the road to Kansas State, and then Baylor at home. That's a tough 4 game stretch in October, and TCU is the type of team that they could win all 4 of those games, they could lose all 4 of those games, and none of it would be surprising. So, I think this team, if they can get Josh Herbert to make strides, if they can get an offensive line, a little bit more cohesion with that offensive line, this team could make a run for the title. But I think, 8, 9 wins certainly isn't out of the question as well. I think I've settled on 7 to 8 wins for the Horned Frogs. Moving into the next tier, this is, to me, knocking on the title door. This is a team that's just a tier below the Big 12 favorites. So I've got 2 teams in this tier, starting with Iowa State. And similarly to TCU, I really like Rocco Beck as a quarterback, but he had 2 really good receivers in Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel, who've now moved on to the NFL. And, that's going to be a question mark of how well has Matt Campbell and that offensive staff, how well have they replaced them? And to their credit, they landed 2 really good receivers on the transfer portal, and Chase Sowell and Xavier Townsend, who is going to come in, and those guys are going to have to step up in a significant way for the Cyclones. So I think I think there's more responsibility on his shoulders this year without those 2 receivers. They're going to have a really good running back backfield with I'm blanking on his name, Carson Hansen and Abu Sama. I think that's a really dynamic duo. But they also have to replace some guys on the defense side of the ball. And, this is kind of what happens with Iowa State is, they're a really solid team that doesn't get the respect they deserve. And everybody says they deserve more respect, but then come, preseason talk, here they are, middle of the conference just about, and I think that's just Iowa State. And, to their credit, they went 11-3 last year, finished second in the conference with the loss to ASU in the title game. Their over/under next season is 7.5 wins. I certainly think 8 or 9 wins is in the cards for them, but I think that's going to be key. I think Rocco Beck's development and taking on more responsibility and being more of the leader, right? I think is going to be key to them maintaining that level of play. So I got the Iowa State Cyclones at 6, and number 5. Man, talk about tale of 2 seasons. like starting the year 2-4, and then Sawyer Robinson leading them to 6 straight wins over the course of the latter half of the season last year. Sawyer Robinson and the Baylor Bears, I think, are set up to be pretty competitive this year. They finished 8-5 last year, 5th in the Big 12. They're over under this season, 7.5 wins. I'm leaning towards the over on that. With Dave Aranda, leading this group and running it back, his seat is much cooler than it was last year. And Sawyer Robinson is obviously key to that. He made big plays, and I thought made good decisions throughout the final half of the year. In terms of what they've done to address needs, they went out, they landed a receiver in Kobe Prentice who's going to be a dynamic option in that passing game. They've also done well to add to the defensive side of the ball with a couple of additions at linebacker where they have to replace Matt Jones, who was the heart and soul of that defense. They've also added, a safety in Devin Turner who comes to Baylor from Northwestern where he was productive. and that was kind of the big question mark for the Bears, was that defensive secondary, and adding a dynamic ball hawking safety in Turner, I think is really good for them. But again, this defense is going to their success is going to be contingent upon that linebacker group. They've got three new faces in that group, and it's got to come together for them. But otherwise, this is a group that runs it back, that runs back a lot of last year's team, and with Sawyer Robinson, gaining that confidence of being QB1, I think is going to be big for him. So I'm taking the over on the 7.5 wins, and I think Baylor is knocking on the door, of a conference title. So I've got Baylor at 5. This is where it gets interesting. So with the offseason, the Big 12 favorites, I think it's pretty unanimous across the country. How you have it split, will vary. But starting with BYU at number 4, to be completely transparent, last week when I sent my power rankings to Mitch Harper, I had BYU 3, and then the next day, the Jake Retzlaff sexual assault civil suit dropped. The news on that, and that though there hasn't been any sort of decision as to Retzlaff's future with the Cougars, I think like this is the sort of thing that can be a distraction, and I think it's important to be respectful of the entire situation to Retzlaff and obviously the case itself. I don't want to dive into any of that per se, but I think regardless of what the case's result ends up being and what happens with Retzlaff, this situation has the potential to be, distraction. Um, Maybe isn't the best word, but I think it has the potential to impact the ceiling of this team. Right when you have a quarterback that gained the experience and the confidence that Retzlaff did over the course of last year, that's big for them, and was big for their outlook in 2025. Now with his future up in the air, if he remains with the team, this case um, is going to linger, on his mind, and I think it can certainly impact things. So, outside of that quarterback position, the Cougars have a pretty solid roster, and I think they are going to be in contention. They're going to be competitive. They've done well to address some needs in the transfer portal, and yeah, they've done well there. But yeah, I think if Retzlaff, if we have an idea of what Retzlaff's future with BYU is going to be sometime in the near future, that could impact where BYU stands, where they fall in this ranking. They may fall a tier or two, just kind of depending on what happens with Retzlaff. But otherwise, this is a pretty solid roster across the board, offensively, defensively. You like that they bring back experience at each of their skill positions. They bring back a solid offensive line, bring back a good core on the defensive side of the ball, despite the fact that they've lost some key pieces, guys like Tyler Batty and Jacob Robinson and Harrison Taggart. They've got guys that are coming up behind them that are pretty promising. So again, depending on what happens with Retzlaff, I have BYU 4 right now. But that can certainly play a role. I think there's some other factors that will contribute to BYU's potential regression this season. Coming off an 11-2 season, I don't know that they have the top end talent to maintain that level of success in the Big 12, especially given the turnover margin that they had last year. I think that is kind of the big reason why I think BYU is going to come back to the middle of the Big 12. Is it's hard to replicate turnover success year over year. You can get close and it can be a point of emphasis, but getting back to that sort of turnover margin in back-to-back years is pretty tough. So, and I think too, obviously the target is going to be on their back. They're not going to be able to get by anybody, sneak up on anybody, I should say. They're going to get a lot of people's best shots, and that's going to be a different look. So I have BYU for right now, but again, depending on Retzloff's situation, they could drop they could drop a bit. So I have them for number three. I have Kansas State, and they finished last year 9-4, finished eighth in the conference with a 5-4 conference record. Their over under next season is 8.5 wins. And, this is the team where kind of reading up on them over the course of spring ball, I actually like what they've done and like sort of the progress that they've made this offseason. This is the team where I feel um, a lot, I feel they've improved the most based on what they've done this offseason. Um, obviously, I think Avery Johnson is without a doubt the single most talented quarterback in the Big 12. But last year, his first year as a full time starter, you saw sort of the mental lapses and some of the issues with a young quarterback. And I think, as long as he makes progress and continues to do the things that he's supposed to do, I think he can make a big jump this year. And I think last year will serve as sort of the growing pains. I think Kleiman and his staff have done a good job of bringing in pieces around him to maximize Johnson's potential in 2025. They brought in a couple of receivers in Jaron Tibbs and Jaron Bradley, who I think, adding that to the mix of Jace Brown, I think will help that passing game a lot. That was a big issue for Kansas State last year, was that passing attack. And so you've added them there. You've brought in a five-star talent at tight end in Lincoln Cure. And so I like what they've done in bringing in talent around Avery Johnson. But most importantly is they've bolstered the offensive line in front of it. So Kansas State lost I think, three offensive linemen from last year's roster, but they brought in a handful of transfers. And I think the guy to keep in mind here when talking about uh, you know transfer portal impact players, I look at offensive tackle George Fitzpatrick as kind of the key piece here to the Wildcats' outlook. He's a transfer from Ohio State. He's expected to come in and play that left tackle spot, and if he finds success in that role, I think that'll be big for the Wildcats in that offensive line. They've brought in three other offensive line transfers, one from USC, one from Pitt, and one from Penn State, which not all of them are going to be starters. They're going to serve. They're going to be in competition for a starting role, but at the very least, they shore up the depth along that offensive line. So those are the big reasons why I'm more optimistic about Kansas State than I was previously. Is I like what they've done in uh, in the position groups around Avery Johnson with receiver, tight end, and offensive line. They have to replace DJ Giddens, who was a dynamic running back last year, who went on to the NFL. But they've got a couple pieces, Dylan Edwards and another running back that I'm blanking on. But they've got a good group to work with. The defense is going to be tough just because that's Kleiman's calling card. They play a tough brand of ball, and they've got a really good defensive line that returns a lot of production from last year, a lot of depth. But the big question mark on that side of the ball is the defensive secondary. So that's the big question mark for the Wildcats: is what sort of progress do they make on in coverage. So yeah, I'm optimistic about the Wildcats. I think they're going to be one of the favorites this year. Number two, I've got the Texas Tech Red Raiders, and this revolves entirely around what they've done in the transfer portal. And when you invest as much as they have in the portal, they're obviously looking to cash out with the Big 12 championship. They've gone into the portal and added pieces at running back, at wide receiver, along the offensive line. They've added defensive linemen and players in the defensive secondary, guys that they're expecting to come in and plug holes, not only plug holes, but be dynamic playmakers for them. And I think that conversation starts with David Bailey and Romello Height, two guys that are going to add a dynamic punch to that pass rush. The big question mark for them is what sort of progress does Bayron Morton make? He was productive. He was safe last year. He's going to have the skill players around him to continue to do that. He doesn't have Taj Brooks, and that's kind of the question mark there. Is what do they have at running back? And then two at offensive line. They brought in two um, two linemen from the transfer portal, two highly touted linemen that uh, didn't participate a whole lot in spring ball or weren't with the program throughout spring ball, but are going to be counted on to play big roles this season. But I think with what they return from last year's roster, with what they've brought in from the transfer portal, they brought in a lot of high level difference makers, and I think they're pushing their chips to the center of the table. They're going all in, and so I've got to respect that. But obviously we'll see if it all comes together for them in 2025. But they finished last year 8-5 and 6-3 in the conference. Their over under win total is 8.5 wins, and I think that's on the money in terms of making a difficult line and making a difficult bet. I think going 8-4, going 9-3 is very much a possibility, and getting to double digit wins is also in the cards for them as well. Which gets me to my top team among the Big 12 favorites, and I still have the Arizona Sun Devils at number one. Obviously, when you win the conference, that comes with a bit of extra respect in my book. Obviously, if you want to be the champion, you got to beat the champion, and so that's the Sun Devils this year. And they obviously, when you talk about the Sun Devils, the conversation starts with how do they replace Cam Scadaboo, and that's going to be by committee, and that's a sign of respect to what Scadaboo did. But that's not a knock on what the Sun Devils have at the running back position. They've got some dudes that can carry the ball, that can make plays, and they brought in a couple transfers. Kanye Udo out of Army, who's he's not going to be the bell cow that Scadaboo was, but he's going to be close. And they've got some other options in that backfield, and Raleek Brown and a couple others that are going to contribute as well. But the Sun Devils return Sam Levitt at quarterback, who was really, really impressive as a game manager, and he was really impressive as a clutch performer for the Sun Devils in year one. I think Kenny Dillingham did a great job of making his life easy by having a good running game, and I think that's still going to be the point of emphasis with this offense moving forward, especially with the offensive line and what they return there. But the Sun Devils return Jordan Tyson, who's viewed as one of the top wide receivers in the conference. They also return a really good tight end room, which is headlined by Shimon Mateer, who really came on over the last half of the season and developed a really good chemistry with Sam Levitt. So you've got those two leading the way, and I like what the Sun Devils have done in the transfer portal. It wasn't a big transfer portal class, but I thought that they added some good pieces, specifically at wide receiver, bringing in a couple guys that could potentially elevate that group as well. And then this defense, this Arizona State defense is tough, and they return a lot of the guys that they had on that side of the ball last year. And they've brought in a couple key pieces in the defensive secondary, Nyland Green and a couple others to help elevate and address some of the losses that they've had there. But this is going to be another good Sun Devils team. And, obviously in the Big 12, no program has ever won back-to-back titles. But I think the Sun Devils' chances to repeat should be taken seriously. I think they've done a really good job of, building this roster and building a good competitive culture, and that's a respect to Kenny Dillingham and the job he's done there. So I think he's a great culture builder, and they've got the culture really strong down there. So they're going to be competitive, and they're still my number one Big 12 team. So that's my list. Again, 1 ASU, Texas Tech, Kansas State, BYU. Number 5 Baylor, 6 Iowa State, 7 TCU, 8 Utah. Who again, I think with all the changes that they've had, there's a renewed sense of excitement and hunger around the program. A lot is going to depend on Dampier making the adjustment to the Big 12, but I think if he does that, this team could jump a tier. And then number 9, I've got the Colorado Buffaloes. Number 10, Kansas Jayhawks. Number 11, Cincinnati Bearcats. Number 12, Houston Cougars. 13 West Virginia, 14 Arizona, 15 Oklahoma State, and 16 UCF. So that's my Big 12 power rankings. Feel free to hit me with your rankings. Would love to hear from you guys and how you sort of view the conference right now. I think it's certainly interesting. A lot of discussion, a lot of debate, and a lot of different ways that you can view the conference. Obviously, a lot can change over the coming weeks with certain things going on in the conference and all that. But I think that's how I sort of view the conference right now. So appreciate everybody again for tuning in and watching on YouTube. If you do that, or if you listen on your podcast platforms, I appreciate that as well. And it's been a lot of fun. And again, I'm going to have an episode out Friday to preview this weekend's visitors, and then we'll kind of get into more of a regular schedule from there as well. So appreciate everybody. Myself, I am Steve Bartle, and this is the Utah Blockcast, and I am signing off.